Good worship today. If you would, find 2 Timothy chapter 4. We are going to be finishing with 2 Timothy. We've been in 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy. Next week, we're going to shift gears and we're going to start looking at the Gospel of Matthew and go in a different direction. But today we have this unique opportunity to get a little insight into Paul's personal experience, in particular, how he faces death. We're going to get this really unique instance of him and in prison, not sure when he's going to happen, what's going to happen, knowing that any day he could be taken before Caesar and before the day is over, put to death or set free. And he thinks about death. He knows that his life is sort of coming to the end. And this sermon is probably for everybody, but if you happen to be in the last third or the last fourth, or the last 99th, whatever fraction. But if you're lived a great deal of your life and you don't have a long way to go yet, there's probably some words there to hear. But before we do that, I want to just think a little bit about Paul. We've talked about him, and frankly, there probably is no individual who has influenced Christianity as we know it, apart from Jesus Christ, more than the Apostle Paul. What we believe doctrinally, what we believe about Jesus, Christology, what we believe who Jesus is, almost all of that comes from the 13 letters that Paul wrote. How we do church is shaped by what he said to churches about what they should do and what they shouldn't do and what they were doing wrong, and we have our understanding. In fact, probably we know more about what Christian families are to be from the teachings of Paul and the things that he addresses. He has just a phenomenal impact on us. So maybe it's good just to be reminded, because in those 13 letters, and every once in a while, there'll be a little personal point. Or you'll mention something about his personal life. Or if the book of Acts is very much about the story from the 9th chapter on, is about the story of Paul and the spreading of the gospel. So maybe it's just good to be reminded of some things about him. First of all, his name when he was born was not Paul. It was Saul. And he was born in the city of Tarsus. Tarsus is up in Asia Minor. You go up the Mediterranean coast to Asia Minor, and Tarsus was a very prominent city in the Greek world and in the Roman world. In fact, there was a huge university there, actually founded by Alexander the Great. It was a great center for learning, and we kind of get the feeling that Paul's education, even in Tarsus, was pretty significant. We know that he was a Jew. His father was a Jew. He was a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin, so he was raised as a Jew. Somehow, he was also a Roman citizen. Now, that was really rare. There really were not very many individuals in Israel or in the life of Judaism who were Roman citizens. There was a very, very windowed, narrow way to be able to get that, and we don't know anywhere about it, but it plays very big in Paul's later on life to be able to appeal to Caesar because he was a Roman citizen and had that right. We know that eventually he moves to Jerusalem to go to school. He goes to the school of Gamaliel. Now, Gamaliel was a rabbi, and so Paul would have gotten the training that a scribe or a teacher of the law, a rabbi would get. But Gamaliel was also, his school was very broad in a classical education, so Paul would have learned Greek and Latin, and he would have learned ultimate languages. He would have learned philosophy. He would have learned a lot of things about the world, the science of the world. He would have all of those things. The reality is Paul is probably the most educated man in the New Testament. In fact, if you really get down to it, the vocabulary in Paul's letters is way up there. He uses words in his letters that nobody else even thinks about using. In fact, if you go to seminary and you study Greek and you start to translate, you never start with Paul's letters. You start with Peter and John. They were fishermen. They used simple, small words. They were aiming at a lower, they did simpler words. But Paul uses words that are really kind of bizarre, that are philosophy words, classical words, words that have deep meaning. But what that means is that when you read his writings, sometimes he talks about terms that are deep and broad and majestic in the way they describe spiritual things. Well, he gets that education. He's in Jerusalem. We don't know if he is there when Jesus is there. As far as we don't know whether he ever heard Jesus, whether he was there during the crucifixion, but we know that he's in Jerusalem when Stephen preaches his sermon in the book of Acts and angers the people listening, and they stone him to death. Now, we don't know and we don't believe that Saul had anything directly to do with it. We don't think he picked up a stone and he threw it, but the Scripture says that while they were stoning Stephen, and Stephen is looking up into heaven, and he sees Jesus at the right hand of the Father, that Paul is holding the coats of the men throwing the stones. And the Scripture says that he approved of the stoning of Stephen. But I've often thought that event must have changed Saul later on. We know that he was a Pharisee. And by the way, sometimes Pharisees get real bad names, like they're the black hat and the guys with the black mustache, so they're the bad guys. But actually, a Pharisee was an individual, a man, who made a commitment to obey the law of God to his complete ability. Everything that he could do. And by the way, Paul said he was not just a Pharisee, he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees, so that he was serious about obeying God and doing it to the very utmost of his ability. And by the way, there's not much ever said about Paul's wife, but Pharisees had to be married. So he probably was married, and we don't know whether his wife died or whether she stayed home. There's some suggestion that she may have been an unbeliever, because you remember one time Paul wrote to a church and he said, if you're married to an unbeliever and they want to leave you when you become a believer, let them go. And people wondered if maybe that's what happened. Well, the bottom line is that Saul now is persecuting Christians. In the book of Acts, the 9th chapter begins with Saul, breathing threats and murder, had received a letter from the high priest in Jerusalem to go to the synagogues of Damascus, and if he could find any followers of the way in Damascus, they were going to arrest them and tie them bound and bring them back to Jerusalem to stand before the Sanhedrin. But on the way, something happened. On the way, Saul is confronted by Jesus. There's a flash, and all of the men who are with him go unconscious. And in that bright light, Paul is no longer able to see. And Jesus appears to him and speaks to him, and he tells him to go on into Damascus. And there in Damascus, a believer by the name of Ananias is instructed by the Lord to go and talks with Saul and tells him about Jesus, and somewhere on the road or in Damascus, somewhere in the midst of that, Saul, who has been a persecutor of Jesus, now is a believer. And by the way, his sight is restored, but you remember that he has a thorn in the flesh. 3 times he prays, and he has some physical disability that bothers him, and he 3 times prays and asks God to take it away, and the Lord says, no, my grace is sufficient for you. You're not going to get healed of this. One of the real suggestions that it's his eyesight. And that even though he's able to see after his encounter on the road to Damascus, he never is really able to see very well, and that maybe there's some problem with his eyes that continues on, and Jesus, who could heal the blind, does not heal him. In fact, in one of his letters, Paul dictates it, and at the end, he says, see how I'm writing in my own hand and with what large letters I use. And if you ever know anybody who doesn't see well, they write very big. We don't know for sure about that, but we know that he suddenly now is a follower of Jesus. And in those early years, he goes into the synagogues and is not received very well. We know that somehow he goes for about 3 years out into the wilderness. And there he prays and he reads the Scriptures, and God reveals himself throughout the Old Testament of who Jesus is. And eventually Barnabas comes and finds him. When the Christians are afraid of him and they won't listen to him, Barnabas befriends him and mentors him and brings him to Jerusalem and introduces him to the apostles, and a relationship is forged. And then he begins to be the missionary, and God gives him a call for the Gentiles to take the gospel to other places. And Barnabas and Paul, and his name is now changed because he is changed. And they do their journeys, and then eventually he goes with Silas, and there are 3 missionary journeys. And much of what we understand about the call for missions, the taking of the gospel, comes from the Great Commission of Jesus, but comes from the example of Paul. Finally, he returns to Jerusalem. He's been preaching and teaching to Gentiles, and a rumor starts in Jerusalem that he has brought a Gentile into the temple, into the court that is just for Jews. And a riot breaks out. And when the riot starts, the Roman soldiers come. Paul is arrested. He talks to the Sanhedrin. Eventually, he goes on trial before a governor by the name of Festus, and he says, "I appeal to Caesar." And what that meant was the trial stopped right there, and every Roman citizen was allowed to do that. And then he gets on a ship. There's a shipwreck. There's all kinds of events. There's all kinds of stories. But he eventually arrives in Rome. And he's there in a house, a rented house, that he's paying for. In the book of Acts, at the very end of the book of Acts, and the gospel has made all its way to Rome. And at some point, when the book of Acts ends, he's not yet been before Caesar. He's going to do that pretty quickly. And he does know that he could be set free. He could be put to death. He has no certainty. He's at a point in his life where he's had this long life of ministry, and now he knows that it could be over any day. Now, as far as what happened to him, the New Testament doesn't tell us that. There's a tradition of the church that we think is probably true, that at some point he finally has his trial before Caesar, probably 61 or 2 AD. And he's released. And he's allowed to go back and preach. But within a matter of just a few months, there's a new emperor of Rome by the name of Nero. And Nero institutes a new type of persecution. Some of the cruelest and the most horrible things that happened to Christians in that world happened under Nero in 63 or 4 AD. And we believe that almost immediately after being set free, not very long, Nero's persecution begins. Peter is arrested and he's crucified. And we believe that Paul was arrested and this time taken to Mamertine prison, and he stayed there and eventually was beheaded for his faith. But in that time where he's writing to Timothy, he's looking into heaven. He knows his life is almost to an end, and let's see what he has to say. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering. By the way, a drink offering, there were a couple different ways. The Jews didn't do it a lot, the Romans did, but you had a cup of wine, and as an act of obedience or honor or respect, you poured it out. And this idea of, Paul says, my life is being poured out. It's and I'm almost to the tipping point. There's not much left in the cup. My life is almost gone. And the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. Well, 2 things about Paul in the end of his life. One is, as he's looking into heaven, as he knows his life is almost over, he still is concerned about the next generation. And the way to get that is a little bit of the context, because we didn't start, but in this letter, in both of these letters, Paul is intense. I mean, he is commanding, he is telling Timothy what to do. He has given him almost what you might think are final directions. In fact, in chapter 4, I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is the judge of the living and the dead, by his appearing in his kingdom, preach the word. He goes a little bit farther and he says, do the work of the evangelist, be sober. He says, fulfill your ministry, and that's in verse 5, because I am already being offered. It's almost, he says, Timothy, I don't have much longer, but you really need to be going. You're in this moment, and I need you to be faithful at this moment. I need you. It's as if he's more than anything else concerned that the gospel will continue, and Timothy is the next generation. And I guess I would say, if you have grandkids, if you have children, and you're reaching the end of your life, you care about what happens to them. In fact, I've known some folks who've written letters to their children and their grandchildren to be given to them after their death, and words. In fact, I got a letter from my mother, my brother and sister. We got one letter from my mom, and it was kind of to be opened on the event of my death. And she'd written it like 10 or 12 years before she died, but we still had it. We opened it up, and we read it, and I'm telling you what, she kept telling us what to do. She kept straightening us out. I mean, she didn't hold any punches, and she said she loved us, she was proud of us, but she pretty much also said, and by the way, here's what I expect you to do. Well, that's kind of the same feeling that Paul has, and he said, listen, I'm going, and my life is about in, but I'm concerned about you. And I always think within the context of the church, the people that ought to be the most concerned about what we're doing for children and what we're doing for teenagers and what we're doing for young couples and young families and young adults, the folks that ought to be the most passionate about us doing that kind of ministry are the folks who are at the end of their lives. And they're the ones that ought to say, hey, I don't want our church to not be ready for the next generation. They ought to be the ones who are supporting that and pushing it and encouraging it. It's that idea of the next generation. But the main part of this story is that Paul is ready for death. He's ready. In fact, the King James Version actually says, I am ready to be offered. And maybe it's the same thing as being already offered, but basically he is not afraid of death. He is ready to face death. He's ready for whatever death may be. Now, I know that death is not really a fun topic. Most of us don't like talking about it. I have some really good friends that are undertakers, do funeral stuff, and frankly, they have trouble finding friends. People just don't want to hang around with undertakers, funeral directors. They don't. I mean, and very few people say, well, let's see, what do we talk about today? I know, let's talk about death and funerals and dying generally. That's not something we like to talk about. But Paul's in the place where he has nothing else to do. He has to talk about it. And by the way, it is going to happen for all of us. We are all physically going to die. But his conviction, first of all, and he's able to face death without fear. He's ready for death, first of all, because he has a conviction that death is not the end. I've fought a good fight. I've finished my race. I've crossed the finish line. I'm almost there. The tape is out there. I'm almost done. And there's something on the other side. But when he says, my departure is at hand, that is a word that means to get on a ship and go on a voyage. Now, he has done a lot of ship traveling. He has made bon voyages. He's gotten on ships and he's traveled and he's been shipwrecked. But he's saying that when I die, it's like me getting on a ship and I'm going to another place, and it's not a place that you have to fear. Bottom says that we are more than physical bodies. That God made us to be physical bodies, but we are more than that. We each have a living soul. When God shaped man in the garden, then He breathed into him the breath of life. There is something that makes us, that is eternal in nature. Created in God's image doesn't mean your body. It means that you have an eternal soul. And when you and I die, physically, death comes to the body, but that is not the end. And frankly, if you look at 80 or 90 years in this world, that's nothing compared to eternity. So he can face death, and he's ready for death because he knows that it's not the end. There is something beyond it. And that he's ready. And, we talk about death in a lot of different ways. No respiration, you stop breathing. Your heartbeat stops. They check your pulse, and there isn't one. I think the technical has something to do with cord activity, electrical stuff going on in the back of your brain, at the bottom of your brain. But there's a point at which physically there is death, but Paul understands that's not the end. And whether he knew that he was going to be beheaded in one moment, one day, under Nero's persecution, he knew that whatever death was and however it came, that he was entering the presence of God. He knew that it wasn't the end. In fact, if you go to the very end of 2 Timothy, there's a little verse 18. The Lord will rescue me from every evil deed and bring me safely into His heavenly kingdom. He knows that's going to happen. Secondly, he has had a life of faith and faithfulness. In other words, he's at this point in his life and he knows he doesn't have much left, and he looks back and he doesn't have anything to regret. Now, he wasn't perfect. In fact, you remember there's that great story in Romans 7 where he says, boy, there are things I wish I could do and I don't, and things I don't want to do and I sometimes do them. And he has honesty about all of his struggle, but basically his life has been a life of faithfulness to the point that he doesn't have anything to regret. I've fought a good fight. I've kept the faith. I do a lot of funerals. Like 450 since I've been in Effingham. I have buried a couple of churches. I sometimes do them for people who are not even connected to our church. And I will tell you, sometimes they are flat out just easy. I mean, some of the, I don't know, my top 8 or 10 worship services that I've ever been in, about 3 of them are funerals. I mean, just the power of God was there. Talked about Hope Christensen when Hope passed away. And I tell you what, her funeral was fun. I mean, there were just great stories, and she had a great sense of humor, and it was kind of hilarious. And I mean, we all laughed, and we all remembered, and there was some crying going on, and you can get tears. I mean, it can all be good. But there was no question about knowing she was in the presence of God. Her faith was beyond question. We knew where she was. We'd heard her testimony. She'd talked about knowing Christ. Her faith was open. And I want to tell you, that was a fun funeral. I also sometimes get asked to do funerals when they don't have a church. Funeral directors will call and say, Roger, I got a family here. Could you do a funeral for them? And so I always do that. So was your mom a Christian? Was your dad a believer? And I'll tell you, it's tough when they say, I don't know. Good person, good mom, good dad, but I don't know. That's hard. Well, did they ever go to church? Well, not really. It's tough. And we do your best you can and you share the gospel, but the reality is there's something about living and being able to face death when you know that there's been a life of faith. And there's something good about you and I communicating, about believing in Jesus and trusting Him, being able to go to a time when you invited Him into your heart and when you made that public and you told other people. Maybe you walked down the aisle and you did the baptism thing and you gave your testimony, and your family knows that whenever you die, they know when you came to know Jesus because they know your testimony. I'm getting really big on writing it out, making sure they've got it written out so your kids and your grandkids and family, they all know when you came to know Christ, so that when they get ready to you have faced death, there's faithfulness behind you. But then most of all, there's a confidence. And the confidence is in Jesus Christ. The classic question is, so if you die, will you go to heaven? And we've discussed that. The most standard answer, well, I hope so. I think so. Paul doesn't have that. He has confidence. He says, I know that when I go, I'm going to be there. And it's around this word, the crown of righteousness. The Bible talks about several different crowns. There's a crown of life, crown of righteousness. Let me tell you what I think it means, and I think you can understand it from Paul's other writings. He's not getting a crown of righteousness because he was so righteous. He was so good, so perfect that he never failed. That's not why he gets the crown of righteousness. Because I think the reality is that when you and I die and we stand before God, and the Bible says it is appointed unto man once to die and then the judgment. That when you and I stand before God in the day of judgment, in that moment after death, we stand before God, every one of us will be judged a sinner. When the books are opened, your life and my life suddenly are up for display. Every one of us have no other play than we are sinners. But at that moment, Jesus Christ, who sits at the right hand of the Father, who is the only one in heaven who really deserves a crown, steps down and says, Father, don't look at their righteousness, look at mine. Because I have died for them. And they trusted me, and I have forgiven their sin. And the righteousness that you and I have in the moment of judgment is not ours, it's Jesus. And He takes His crown off and puts His crown of righteousness on the person who has died, and they are accepted not because they are perfect, not because they have overcome all sin, not because they have not failed, but they have received the righteousness of Jesus Christ. Now that's what Paul teaches about how we are justified and how we stand in the day of judgment. And Paul says, I'm not worried about hell or heaven because I know the one who has the crown of righteousness, and He's going to share it with me on that day. I like that. That simple promise of where we would spend eternity. And today, I just would suggest to you that as uncomfortable it is to talk about death, it's a good thing to be ready. I use this passage an awful lot in funerals. Actually, I've only got about 3 or 4 passages that I use. I only have one sermon. I just change the names and plug in people, and it's kind of just always the same thing. Steve actually has preached my sermon. He's taken it and he's used my funeral sermon for somebody else. It's kind of only one message. I mean, they're just some basic stuff, because bottom line is you got to be ready. And you're ready because you have trusted Jesus Christ and received His righteousness. And because you've had a life of faith that's open and honest and easily to be seen. And then all of a sudden, death is not the end. It's the end of struggle. It's the end of the fight. It's the end of the race. Honestly, today, after the service, I'm going over to the hospital. I have a lady from our church, Rosanna. She's 99. For 10 years, she's been saying, why can't I go be with Jesus? I'm stuck in this body, and I just want to go be with Jesus. She's going to say that when I get there, I know. She's going to say, I don't want to go to the nursing home. I want to go be with Jesus. And we've had this conversation when Jesus says it is. But she knows that death is the entrance into the presence of God. And I hope that you know that. I hope you have it to where there's not a fear. And this little snapshot into Paul's life where he's in that, maybe the prison, maybe in the, probably, we don't know for sure, but he's there and he's not sure about tomorrow. But he's writing to Timothy. And he pretty much says, now, Timothy, I don't have much time left. I'm not worried about me. I just want to make sure you're ready to keep serving God once I'm gone. Well, today we're going to sing When We All Get to Heaven. Seems like a good one. And I hope maybe that you're ready. And you don't have to be ready for this moment, but to be spiritually ready for death whenever it comes. That's a good thing. And that's one of those final things Paul lets us know. Let's stand and let's sing. If you need to come for some reason, to be certain about Christ, to make some public commitment, we invite you to do that right now.